Thank you very much for this honor. It's not a ceremony that I'm familiar with in my own country. And I very much appreciate the scholarship of both of these gentlemen. I kept being surprised and wondered, where did you learn about that? Did I really put that in print? Or did I only think that? It's also been a great privilege to spend time, for the second time, in Portugal. And when I was a child of 5 or 6, my hero was Magellan, which is the English version of his last name. So, a strange coincidence. I won't try and give it meaning, but it's enjoyable. What I'm going to describe today is some of the background of my work, which has been alluded to before, but you haven't been able to see it visually. And of course, that's the wonderful thing about doing research on faces, is that you can show your material. And my emphasis is going to be, after giving that background, covering 30 or 40 years of research and thinking, to talk about how we can apply this to our life. That's why I've given this title, Emotional Skills. What is the use of all of this research if it doesn't improve how we lead our life? And so, in the last 5 to 7 years, I have shifted my focus from basic research to applied research on how to develop these skills. So we'll get to that. So when I first entered this field, 1963, the dominant voice was Margaret Mead. There you see Margaret Mead. Shouldn't confuse her with her Samoan friend. This is actually fairly late in her life. But Mead took a very strong and strict position that facial expressions were totally the product of culture. And so an expression of joy in one culture might well be an expression of sadness in another. And she argued this very strenuously, and Margaret Mead was a good academic politician. She was actually cited in 2 Supreme Court cases. And this was the view, and it actually was my view as well. When I started this work, I knew there was a contrary view of Charles Darwin. This is a portrait of Darwin shortly after the voyage of the Beagle. And when you read his notes from which he prepared his best-selling book, The Voyage of the Beagle, he was amazed that as he spent this 5 years of travel on a world voyage, 5 years, that he felt he could understand the expressions of the people he saw. He knew he couldn't understand their words, but he could understand their expressions, and so he pondered, what would that mean? Now, in the book he wrote in 1872, many years later, the book was entirely written in the 1830s, but he waited. Darwin was always one who waited a long time to publish. I like to tell my students that there are a remarkable number of things about Darwin that may or may not be related to his being such an important scientist. The first is he never had a paying job in his life. The second is he never taught a class. And the third is he never had a student. Okay? But he wrote books that were bestsellers and earned quite a lot of money. And he married a Wedgwood. So he married well. It's advice my father gave me that I didn't follow. Darwin argued in the Expression book, which was a bestseller in its time, that the universality of expression would not support the theory of evolution, because if we all descended from Adam and Eve, we would all have the same expressions. But what it did directly challenge was the racist theories of his time that claimed that Europeans had descended from a more advanced progenitor than Africans. No, Darwin said, expressions are the same, one common progenitor. It was the work that you cited on other animals and how you explain them that that Darwin felt supported his theory of evolution. And Darwin claimed that many animals, emotions are not unique to humans. Bees get angry, Darwin wrote. Well, when I first started this research, I didn't really care who was right or wrong. I thought Mead was probably right. And I selected some photographs, if I can have the next slide. Pictures like these, which I went to Brazil and Argentina, as you heard, and Japan, and I showed these to people and asked them, is she afraid, angry, sad, disgusted, or happy? And of course the majority called her angry and called her disgusted and afraid, happy, surprised, sad. Well, that all contradicted Margaret Mead. But there was a loophole, which was that all of these people I had studied in these very different countries with different languages, Portuguese, Spanish, English, Japanese, but they'd all been exposed to movies, television, magazines, and maybe they all learned expression from this source. And for that reason, I felt I had to go to a Stone Age culture in New Guinea. And there you see me, 1967, 41 years ago, starting to hike up to the highlands of New Guinea, where I studied a group of people who were still a Stone Age culture. They were literally using stone implements, and had, the people I used in the research had never seen an outsider. Can I show you the next? Now this is the expression of one of the people in this culture when he saw me eating a can of food that I had brought with me. You wouldn't think that he wants any of it. And if you had looked at my face when I watched him eat his food, you would have seen the same expression. But of course, this is an anecdote, useful, but we needed scientific evidence, and so one of the studies we constructed was to ask people to stand in front of a camera. Now, they didn't know what a camera was, they'd never seen a photograph, so they weren't self-conscious. And to give them very simple stories. The first story was, your friends have come. The next story was, your child has died. And the next story was, someone does something you don't like, but you're not going to fight. And, oh, I'm sorry, this is you are going to fight. And the next one is, someone does something you don't like and you are not going to fight. Now, when we showed these photographs to students in California, of course, and asked them to choose which emotion they had no problem. This was one of 2 experiments we did there that provided very strong evidence. Fortunately for me, Carl Heider, the son of a very famous psychologist, an anthropologist, heard about my findings and said they're totally wrong. In the culture I work in another part of New Guinea, they don't even have words for emotion. So how can you have found this? So I said to Heider, I'll give you all of my materials, spend a week or 2 in my lab, I'll teach you how to use them, and then you can go out and prove me wrong. And of course, I'm sitting here wearing this medal because Heider got exactly the same results. It's the ideal thing in science if you can find someone who's opposed to you, who's willing to spend the time to repeat your work, then if it comes out the same way, we can better trust it. The next. So facial expressions of emotion are universal. Notice I say facial expressions, because that's what I was focusing on, not voice or posture. And it was for the next one, 7 emotions. They don't all show up so well. That's anger at the top, fear, sadness, disgust, happiness, surprise, and contempt. Contempt, disgust, and anger are in red because those are emotions that tend to give us more trouble in how we deal with other people. The next slide. So what is universal is the signal, a few themes for each emotion. If an object moves very quickly towards us, into our visual field, we'll get a fear response. We don't need to learn that. It's an unlearned response. But most of what we are afraid of or become angry about are things that we've learned. They're variations on these themes. Now, collaboratively with Robert Levinson at Berkeley, we did studies of the physiology of emotion and found universals for 4 emotions we examined in a number of cultures. And as my colleague Nico Freida, who is a famous Dutch psychologist standing against the wall right over there, I put him taking photographs for me. He was one of the earliest to point out that you can think of emotions as action tendencies, and not actions, it's a tendency. So when I get angry, my head moves forward and I am prepared physiologically to hit, because the blood goes to my arms. But I may tell a joke. Maybe it's a nasty joke. Maybe I'm angry, but I'm afraid, and so I will run away. When I get afraid, we are physiologically prepared. The blood in the body goes to the large muscles in the legs, preparing you to run. But that's what evolution does for you. It's not what you necessarily will do. Come on back. Now, I also tried to explain why it was that so many wise people, like Margaret Mead, had been misled and thought that these expressions were solely the product of culture. And so we arranged an experiment in which we had students in Tokyo and students in Berkeley both sit in a room alone, not knowing there was a camera, and watching some very unpleasant films. And then we brought a man in a white coat, a scientist, into the room and had them watch more unpleasant films. And now you see the Japanese mask the negative emotion with what's called for in that culture. So within that experiment, this is it was published in 72, the data collected in 68. When alone, we got virtually identical facial expressions. In a social situation, we got totally different. So you see what we called, if we can have the next slide, What is culture specific are display rules about who can show what emotion to whom. At that time in Japan, the display rule was you do not show disgust to an authority figure. Of course, in Berkeley, in 1968, you show disgust to an authority figure, no reason to inhibit it. But many of the variations on the triggers and the attitudes we have about each emotion, whether it's appropriate to show it or not. I worked in a culture in Indonesia where it is a great, if you ever get angry, it's a great source of shame. You're never, ever supposed to manifest anger. Can we move to the next? Now there are also individual differences. This is part of my most current work that I've developed. There are differences, of course, in the most potent triggers of emotion for us. We don't all get angry about the same thing or afraid of the same things. But these are also very interesting. Some of us, our emotions come about very quickly. For some of us, they're very intense. For some of us, they last a long time. And for, again, some of us, it takes a long time to get over it. I call this your emotional profile. And in another 2 or 3 months, we'll have a tool on the internet that allows you to identify your own emotional profile. Our research evidence shows that if, for example, you have fast emotional responses to anger, they'll be fast to fear, to disgust, to sadness. They're not emotion specific. And if it's fast in terms of heart rate change, it'll be fast in terms of facial muscular change. So these are rather unified and not easily susceptible to change. So let's go on to the next slide. In psychology, we have tended to gloss all of the enjoyable emotions under one term, happy. But I believe that each of these is as different one from another as fear is from anger. Most of them I shouldn't need to translate, except the last three. In English, we don't have a word, which the Italians do, for that pleasure you get in meeting a challenge, for stretching yourself to the limit. Very important. Again, in English, we don't have a word. This is Yiddish, for the pleasure you get in the accomplishment of your offspring. When your child stands on your shoulders, when your child does something that you think is wonderful, I think that's a very important motivating factor for us, putting up with all the difficulties of parenting. And probably you all know this one. We don't have a word for it in English, but we certainly enjoy the suffering of our opponents. So the fact that you don't have a name for it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Now, all of these are signaled on the face by the same expression. But the voice, there's a different vocal sound for each. And now there's evidence cross-culturally for 5 of these. They haven't tried the rest. But think for a moment the difference between the sound of relief and the sound of amusement. They don't sound the same. So the voice is a signal system that's very differentiated for positive emotions. Go on to the next. Well, one gets into arguments with your colleagues and with people in general. Well, what is an emotion? I mean, is depression an emotion? Is love an emotion? Is jealousy an emotion? This is my list. I usually don't like to read the words, but I don't know how easy it is for all of you to see it. One characteristic of an emotion is that we don't choose to have it. It's unbidden. Another is that typically it comes about very quickly. Another is that we're not usually aware of what triggered our emotion until afterwards. That we are influenced in our emotion both by our own early development and by what we've inherited from our ancestral environment. Each emotion has distinctive physiology and sensations and signals. And I have so far not found an emotion that has all these other characteristics which is absent in another primate. They are not unique to humans. But I know people might well disagree, but at least this is my viewpoint. Can I have the next? So each emotion, I've just put 4 of them here, has a related mood. Moods last for a lot longer, and we usually don't know what brings them about. So apprehensive mood, you can just wake up in an apprehensive mood or in an irritable mood. Now, moods don't last forever, fortunately, but traits do. So if you are a shy person, which is related to the emotion of fear, that characterizes your behavior over most of your life as a melancholic or an optimistic or a hostile person. And then, of course, we have emotional disorders that are highly saturated. Unfortunately, in much of the discussion in the field of psychology and psychiatry, all of these terms are mixed up with each other, and it's like talking about apples and architecture. Very important each, but they're very different phenomena, so I think it's necessary to distinguish them. So now let me turn to the emotional skills. There are 4 of them that we currently teach people. That we teach medical students, nursing students, policemen, anyone who has to deal with other people. The first is the hardest, is to become aware of the impulse before the action. The Buddhists say aware of the spark before the flame. That's very hard to do. I believe that nature didn't design us in such a way as to make that often possible, but it does appear there is some evidence that there are a couple of techniques, one of them coming from the East, meditation, and the other by making a diary of events that call forth regrettable episodes. You can enhance that. Let's move on to the next skill. Again, meditation, and we use a memory exercise which helps you learn the sensations, become more aware of the sensations in your body, so that when you are emotional, you'll know, I'm acting emotionally. Very often we don't, until someone says to us, what are you doing? Why are you so upset? Let's skip the next one. Yeah, let's skip this one. That's just a memory exercise, and go on to the next. Should we keep going? 20. Yeah, because it's right there. It should be number 25. There we go. The third skill is to be aware of the emotions of others. And here we've made some recent progress. If you can give me the next slide. The micro-expressions, which you heard reference to, actually more than reference, I heard quite a lot about, so I won't say too much about it, other than these are very fast, about a 25th of a second. They are the signs of concealed emotion. They can be the result of deliberate concealment or repression. Most of us, 99% of us, don't see them, but amazingly enough, if you go to the next, skip to the next one, so, okay. Yes. They are deliberately concealed or repressed, and as the next slide suggests, when you see a micro-expression, you don't know what triggered it. You don't know you don't want to make Othello's error. Othello was very accurate in reading Desdemona's fear, but what he didn't consider, which one of the two of you mentioned, is that fear looks like fear. So the fear of being disbelieved by your jealous husband looks just like the fear of being caught in an infidelity. Othello didn't consider the first possibility. Many of us don't. It's very important to know that the trigger is not revealed ever by the emotion. You have to figure that out. Let's go on to the next one. This is an online tool that in an hour's time teaches you how to recognize micro-expressions. It's amazing how easy it is to do it. Thousands of people have now, I guess maybe about 15,000, some in medicine, many in government, State Department, airport security, some in the business world. Next slide. This is a bit of data, and all you really need to see is that the lines that don't change are the people who didn't get the training, and the improvement are the people who did. And the groups are Coast Guard, military, college students, and Japanese businessmen. And so in a short period of time, we get a rapid improvement. And let's go on. This is a slide that shows that when people are trained and they then look at real behavior, they do recognize the difference. And the next slide. The last skill is taking this information from microexpressions and using it skillfully. Using it in a way that doesn't make the other person feel self-conscious or that you've invaded their privacy, but using it in a skillful way. Let's skip the next slide and go to the next one after it. In this book, the last one that was published, I discuss how you can use this information in family life and friendship and in the business world. And now the last slide. And this is the book that will be out in September. I had the good fortune to be able to spend 40 hours over the course of 16 months in a one-on-one intense discussion of this topic. And the book is presented as a dialogue. So you get Dan Goleman, who wrote the foreword, said you have a seat at the table. You get to hear and see the two of us arguing with each other. So I hope I've given you some idea of where the research came from and where I am still using it and applying it. And I again thank you very much, not just for your attention, but thank you so very much for this really distinctive, unique honor. Thank you.